Single out salute. I'm Lord Maitreya, the hip hop futurist. You're now tuned into the Superlongevity Institute podcast. This evening I have a special guest. I know I say that all the time because every guest is special when they come here. He's one of the most successful publicists in music history. In the 70s and 80s, he was a publicist for Michael Jackson, Prince, Billy Joel, Kiss, Cyndi Lauper, Earth, Wind & Fire, just to name a few. I read he transformed and satellite launched the careers of Hole & Oates, AC/DC, and Run DMC. His insights into mass psychology is what the Superlongevity Institute is really interested today. We also are interested in what it was like to, work with Prince, Michael Jackson, all the greats that he's had. That's just two of the big names. Ladies and gentlemen, hip hop futurist, transhumanist worldwide, Howard Bloom. I feel like this is too loud.
Well, we've been in touch for 2 years, yes. Something like that, possibly 3, and it's good to finally meet you.
Yes, it is.
So something strange is happening with my Uber conference. Hang on a second. It's playing me hold music.
Okay.
And I don't know where it is. And no, that's Russian. I have no idea. Well, we'll just have to work through it. So, wait, where are you and I? Stop hold music. Okay. Now, where are you and I? We probably are down here. No. Oh, Lord, I've lost us.
Oh.
I've turned off the music successfully. So that's one little thing that was successful. Now, so we should be right over here. There we are. All right. This is what happens when you have 40 windows going at once.
Oh, I do the same thing.
Right.
The same thing. Okay.
So to dive into this, I'll tell you a story.
Okay.
Back in the 1970s, when I started the Howard Bloom organization, I had a client called Buddha Records, run by a man named Art Cass. And Art put out an album by somebody named Sylvia. And she was a middle-aged woman. You know, she didn't have the tiny little hip waist that make women attractive, and she didn't have any of the sexual features going for her. And I thought, why in the world is Art putting out this record? And then the record went platinum. Then Art put out another album by this mysterious Sylvia person. And again, that album went platinum. Utterly baffling, totally baffling. And in those days, we didn't have Google. We couldn't research stuff in 15 minutes. But I kept probing around to find out who this mysterious Sylvia was. And her name was Sylvia Robinson. And back in the 1960s, I think it was absolutely forbidden for a black person to go into the control room of a recording studio, and for a woman to go into the control room of a studio. Sylvia Robinson went into the control room, produced her own record, put it out herself.
Wow.
The song was called Love is Strange. It came out under the name of Mickey and Sylvia. And it not only was it a hit, I wasn't listening to popular music in those days, but I loved that piece of music. Wow. So there was something miraculous about this mysterious Sylvia Robinson. And then one day in 1981, I got a phone call saying, Sylvia Robinson would like to meet with you. Are you interested? Are you kidding me? To me, at this point, Sylvia Robinson is this mystery and this legend. Of course I want to meet with her. So she had her Rolls Royce drive her in from New Jersey, and she came up to my 2-story office with a circular staircase connecting the 2 stories. And we sat, and she said, look, I was driving my car, by which she means she had her driver driving her, around the South Bronx. And kids had cleared the streets and set up huge sound systems with a stage on one end of the street, these massive speakers. and they were using, or they were playing this kind of music I had never heard before. And in it, they were using tracks on albums, record albums, and sampling a small groove, and then sampling another small groove, an almost impossible feat to pull off, to detect exactly where that groove was on that record. And instead of singing, they were sort of talking rhythmically. And she said, so I went back to my studio and I made a piece of music. Sylvia had a little white former dry cleaning plant, a building big enough for about 3 or 4 rooms. And one of those rooms was a studio. So she said, I got my studio musicians together and we recorded a piece of music in that style. And we put it out on a 12-inch single, which was highly unusual back then. But DJs, there were clubs all over the country, and the DJs at those clubs loved these 12-inch singles. And the 12-inch signal went platinum. And the song was Rapper's Delight. And the artists listed on the record were the Sugar Hill Gang, named for Sylvia's record company, Sugar Hill Records, which was named in turn for the very wealthy black part of Upper Manhattan that Sylvia looked up to. Because if you got there, that was heaven. So Sylvia said, I went back and I found the best group in this form of music that I could find, and I'm working to build them, and I want you to build them with me. And they were called Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. Now, we'll fast forward about 6 months, and I was up at the office of Chrysalis Records around 54th Street and Madison Avenue. And there was a guy I had known since he had graduated college and entered the record industry as a kind of seedy hippie. And now, a couple of years later, he had learned to cut his hair in a power hairstyle, wear a power suit. He was obviously on his way to becoming a record company president. There was no question about it. And he saw me at Chrysalis. He looked for an empty corridor, found one, took me into that corridor and said, look, Bloom, you've worked very hard to establish your credibility in this industry. You're working with this new form of music, rap. You know it's shit. I know it's shit. In 6 months, it's going to blow up, and it'll leave shit all over your face. And sometimes, Maitreya, you have to ponder a conversation for a while and let your gut talk to you. And once it had pondered a few hours, my gut knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed to hold on tight to this new form of music. By trying to warm me off of it, in reality, this man was telling me something about its inherent power. So, and then Profile Records came to me with Run DMC. Now, we established Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. We made them a legend in the business. But Run DMC and Russell Simmons, their manager, were going to try something utterly new, and that is to totally cross over rap music, to take it out of its narrow confines, its single lane of rap and R&B, and move it universal. And we did that. So I was very involved with rap up to that point. Meanwhile, when I had my first office, I had an extra room, and there was a guy from California who used to come in and work out of that extra room periodically. And when rap became big and people started throwing around tens of millions of dollars in the rap world, this guy who used to come visit went to Compton, and he found a new kind of rap, gangster rap, and was working to put that on the map. Then one of the leading record companies in rap came to me and said, we want you to work with this artist from Philadelphia. And I looked at the lyrics from his album, and I could not work with him. And because his lyrics were about the glory of killing people. There was no way I could endorse or have anything to do with that. So I went to the record company and I said, look, I'll work with him only on the following conditions: that you let me sit down with him and try to convince him to do another style of lyric. Well, so that was my contact with gangster rap. And that's it. That's my helping
Mm.
pioneer rap music at a time when it was allegedly shit that was going to blow up all over my face.
Well, Raheem, one of my friends, he's in the Furious Five. He knew of you. I asked, I said, you know how I'm doing? He said, yes, I do. I said, he said, who
Well,
doesn't?
but Matria, these guys were like family to me. I
Right.
can't tell you why, but they adopted me. They
Mm.
gave me a special emotional significance in their life. So when
Mm.
they ran into trouble that was really concerning them, they would come to me,
Mm.
which is about the most flattering thing that can happen to you on earth
Mm.
when people trust you and adopt you like that.
That's
But
true.
meanwhile, when the millions started flying,
Mm.
Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five was the dominant group in rap music.
Mm.
And Elektra Records, a big company, Sugar Hill Records, Sylvia's little company, was a little company.
Mm.
But Elektra was a big company.
Wow.
And Elektra offered Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five millions to leave Sylvia and come to them.
Mm.
And when Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five started doing interviews about this, they said that Sylvia hadn't been paying them. That's why
Mm.
they had left Sylvia. And Sylvia called me and said, "Can you help me with this?"
Mm.
And I said, "Yes. Can you get me together Xeroxes of every single check you have ever given to Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five? Can you put it in a brown paper shopping bag so I can carry it around easily?" And Sylvia said, "Yes, I'll do that. Plus, you have to know that the group was doing cocaine, and
Mm.
the cocaine was costing them a lot of money. They had a
Yes.
cocaine dealer on the bus with them when they were
Wow.
touring. So they used to show up at my back door, at my kitchen door,
Mm.
penniless, and they would beg me for money. So I would empty my pockets and give them everything I had. And
Mm.
you won't find any of those transactions in the records, in the
Wow.
official records.
Right.
So I got the paper bag. There were tons of checks. Sylvia had paid them a lot of money.
Mm.
Not as high a royalty as Elektra could pay them because Sylvia was running a tiny little label and
Mm.
she was flying by the skin of her teeth. Um, but nonetheless, a substantial amount of money. So I called up Gil Noble
Oh,
at
Kim Noble. Yes.
yes, right, at who had one of the flagship black TV shows on
Yes.
Sunday afternoons.
Yes. Yes.
And Gil Noble normally wanted nothing to do with my clients because he didn't like to promote the idea that the only thing black people can do is sing and dance.
Mm.
But when I told him about this story, this controversy, he booked me immediately.
Mm.
So I went on TV. I brought the shopping bag with me. I put it on the coffee table between me and Gil and defended Sylvia's case. And nonetheless, the band would come to me when they were emotionally troubled about something.
Mm.
It
Wow.
was remarkable. They didn't hold my defense of Sylvia against me.
Right. 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 Wow. I
So,
wasn't
so
expecting this, ladies and gentlemen. Really wasn't
right.
expecting that. Wow. You just gave
So
me.
they were very good to me. But Tree, you have to
Hmm.
realize, in those days, I was the leading black publicist in the music industry,
Mm.
and that happened because I had been given a job, uh, starting from scratch, a public and artist relations company or department for Gulf and Westerns for 12 record companies,
Mm.
and I had built that department, and it had been a tremendous, tremendous success. And then Gulf and Western had sold its record holdings to ABC.
Wow.
And I got a call from the lawyer who negotiated the deal. Now, business is not my thing. I just don't know anything about it.
Mm.
And he said, "You know why we were able to sell that little pissant record company for so much money to ABC Records?" Well, I had no idea. That's not my department. I don't focus on
Mm.
that. And he said, "It's because of you." And I didn't believe him. And
Wow.
slowly over the course of time, I realized I had basically doubled the value of this bunch of 14 record companies.
Wow.
Now, meantime, I had been at Gulf and Western for a year. We only had one record make the charts,
Mm.
and there was no real band behind it. So I
Mm.
had never gotten to work on a hit record. And when I got to ABC, um, they had a band at number 3 on the pop charts. And I talked around the PR department on the West Coast to find out what was happening. Nothing was happening. And you know why absolutely nothing was happening? Because the lead singer was black. And at that point, it was very uncool for white record executives to have anything to do with black acts, which is ridiculous when you consider that black music and European music are the roots of American music. Without black music, there wouldn't be American pop music, period. So I grabbed hold of that band for all it was worth and studied up on it. And one day went out to LaGuardia Airport from my office in Manhattan to pick up the manager of the band in a limousine, because I knew that taking him back from the airport to Manhattan, we'd be baked in Midtown traffic.
Oh yeah, that's what's good.
And
Yeah.
I would have him as a captive audience. And I said, look, I know your band prides itself on its democracy. I know it prides itself on the fact that every member is equal to every other member. But if you let me put all of the attention on the lead singer, I guarantee you I will give you a star, which is a sentence I've only uttered twice in my life, Matria.
Wow.
This was one of those times. So the manager, who was Tracy Ross Ellis's father and Diana Ross's husband, covered for me. He covered my tale. And I was able to focus all the attention on the lead singer of the band. Now see if that statement, I will give you a star, was valid. Her name is Chaka Khan.
Oh.
The band is called Rufus. The song was called Tell Me Something Good.
Oh, wow.
So, but because I was willing to take black acts not just seriously, I was willing to throw myself in with everything that I am. And I was furious against other white executives for not recognizing the value of this music. And when I started my own company, Artcast at Buddha Records gave me a bassist named Michael Henderson. In the days when little Stevie Wonder was a teenager and was touring, Michael Henderson had been his bassist. And I was busy setting interviews for Michael Henderson, but I needed help. So I hired somebody that I had met through Gladys Knight and the Pips and B.B. King's manager. She was black. She was a real hard worker. She didn't work any of the major outlets that I thought of. Instead, she was working black weeklies. And it turned out there were black weekly newspapers all over the country. And other white publicists didn't know a thing about them. And if they did know, they didn't care. So I built my own list of all of the black weekly newspapers and started dealing with them on a regular basis. And that left me as the leading black publicist in the industry. She was the leading black publicist in the industry, but I could do things for black acts that she had never tried to do. Why she'd never tried, I don't know. She was clearly a talented woman. But at any rate, so I worked with Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Run DMC, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, with Diana Ross for about 10 days. And then I resigned from that account. It was just too painful. And a bunch of other acts you probably haven't heard of, Midnight Star. And
Yeah, definitely heard of Midnight Star. I was listening to them the other day.
Yeah, well, I worked my tail off on them for 3 years to establish them to the best of my ability. And so that was it. That was something I spent a lot of time on. And when Prince's managers called and said, look, we're having trouble at Warner Brothers, the way things were set up is there was a ghetto within a record company. So a record company would hire a bunch of black staff members and keep them behind a wall. And let them do anything they wanted and just take it for granted that they're paying off ministers, they're paying off DJs, whatever they're doing to get us exposure. And we don't want to know about it. And Prince was clearly not a black artist. Yes, of course, he was black, but his music was transcendent.
Right.
His music was black, it was pop, and it was rock and
That's
roll
right.
all
Yes.
at once.
Yes.
So Prince's managers called and said, we're having a problem with this record company. Record companies throw black acts to their black staff and won't allow them to cross that invisible barrier within the record company
Right.
that gets to the major executives. What do we do about this? So I wrote a memo that they used to pummel down those walls. But at that point, Matria, I had been trying to break down those walls for roughly 6 years.
Wow.
In the record companies. And with Prince, we finally broke those walls down. And Michael, who I wasn't working with yet, also broke those walls down. Definitely. So when Michael and Prince happened at once, they established a new musical genre. Once upon a time, Motown had been crossover music. This was bigger than crossover music, Prince and Michael Jackson, because it wasn't just crossover music. It was crossover icons. White kids could grow up with a picture or a poster of Prince on their wall, or a poster of Michael Jackson on their wall. That's something that hadn't happened for Smokey Robinson,
right.
Or any of the Motown acts.
Right.
And I used to explain to my artists, you don't just owe your audience your songs. You owe your audience your life. And it took me 20 or 30 years to figure out what the hell I meant. Sometimes you know something at a gut level, and your conscious brain has a hard time keeping up.
Right.
So what I meant was, if what we do is successful, you will be an icon. And when kids are making the most difficult transition of their lives at the age of 11 and a half and 12 and 13, and they're transitioning from being children to being fully sexual, it's one of the most confusing periods in your life. Yeah. And because your body is screaming at you to get out of your parents' home and establish yourself in a world of your peers, a world of your peers that's profoundly alienating and profoundly confusing. Those kids will put your poster up on their walls. They will use you as a trellis to grow on, as a framework on which to grow. You will become their role model. So they're not just going to be looking at that picture and admiring your music. Right. They're going to be looking at that picture and admiring what the hell you really are. And my job was to find out what the hell they really were and get it across to the people who might be interested in, and to make sure the people were interested in them.
Wow.
So Prince became an icon. Michael Jackson already was an icon. Bob Marley already was an icon. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five were virtually unknown. And the list, and Shaka Khan, of course, was totally unknown. And the list goes on and on.
How did you get into the world of being a publicist? How did your career start? Because I know you were into science. I did listen to you talk about you were doing some work on the immune system for cancer.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it is a peculiar story because at the age of 10, I got into science very seriously. And I got into microbiology and theoretical physics. And by the time I was 12, I was developing scientific credentials. I co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards. I built my first Boolean algebra machine. I was taken over for a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo, my hometown university, who came out after an hour of discussing the Doppler shift and Big Bang versus steady state theory of the universe, and told my mom, you don't have to save for grad school for him. He'll get fellowships in theoretical physics wherever he wants. Wow. And then at 12, yes, I was working at the world's largest cancer research facility. I was supposed to be a lab assistant in cutting edge work on the immune system, but instead I was trying to solve something in theoretical physics called the CPT problem, which is if matter and antimatter are created in equal amounts at the same time, where's all the antimatter? And I solved that problem by the end of the summer and came up with a theory. It's called the Bloom Big Bagel, or the Bloom toroidal model of the cosmos. And you can find it on YouTube. It's had over 800,000 hits. It's a 5.5-minute animation. It's real simple.
Wow.
And it predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for 38 years, dark energy. And it explains what dark energy is, why it works. So, but at the age of 12, I realized that my
Mr.
synagogue,
Bloom,
yeah,
because you can't just say dark energy. I have to ask you more. Can you elaborate on what dark energy is? Because I hear this from hip hoppers all the time. Actually, go ahead.
Dark energy is, we can watch the universe unfolding. We've managed to see a star that was born in the first billion years. We just did this week, of the cosmos' existence. And the universe is expanding. So we can see the universe expanding uniformly, no matter what direction we look, until we get past the 7.5 billion year mark in the biography of the universe. And then stars and galaxies start doing something that's utterly inexplicable. Instead of expanding at a steady rate, they begin to accelerate. Now, if you've ever driven a Porsche, to get it to accelerate, you have to put your foot on the gas pedal. Acceleration takes energy. So where the hell is the energy coming from that is accelerating the galaxies and the stars? That's dark energy. So they assume that it's a form of energy. They don't know what it is, so they call it dark energy. The Big Bagel theory says, imagine a bagel with one of those infinitely puckered, tiny little irritating holes. And that's the second of the Big Bang. And a positive universe, a normal universe, comes out on the upper side of the bagel from the Big Bang at the hole. And a negative universe, an antimatter universe, comes out on the underside of the bagel. Well, these two universes are like cannonballs. They're shot by an explosion until they reach the hump in the bagel, where instead of going up, the bagel starts going down. And then they start accelerating because they speak a language to each other. The normal universe and the antimatter universe share a common language, gravity. And they have run out of the energy that shoots them apart from each other and are beginning to feel the whisperings of the universe beneath them or on the other side of the bagel. And so they accelerate the more they feel the gravity of the opposite universe, the faster they go, until finally they meet on the outer edge of the bagel and annihilate each other. And the outer edge of the big bagel, through a trick in something called topology, is the bagel's hole for the next universe.
Wow, that was very interesting. I don't know, part of the reason why I do this podcast is to inspire the young hip hoppers to get into science. And the way you explain that in the metaphor of the bagel was awesome. I want to get into some of your books though too.
Okay.
This book right here, how I created the Sixties.
Right, how I accidentally started the 60s.
How I accidentally created the 60s. What is this book about? And did you really create the hippie movement?
Well, I had a role in it. Only history will tell whether it was a big role or a small role. But nobody liked me in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. Nobody. Kids. One day, I was walking down the street and I saw a bunch of kids choosing up sides for a baseball game. They saw me coming, and they didn't want to have anything to do with me. So they picked up their bats, their balls, their gloves, and they found another field in which to have the baseball game so that I wouldn't be able to find them. Wow. That's how popular I was in Buffalo, New York. And my parents were too busy after World War II establishing a life for themselves and didn't have any time for me. They treated me like a speck of dust or an inanimate object. If I'd been a pet, I would have gotten more attention. So when I was 12 years old, I was reading Time magazine from cover to cover. And my best friend and I were winning the Time magazine current events competition every year, tying for winning. And Time magazine, in order to satisfy your sexual curiosities and your sexual desires as you were commuting from Connecticut into Madison Avenue in your gray flannel suit, had an article every week on the progression of this group that believed in free love, which meant free sex,
Right.
called the Beatniks.
Mm.
And I thought that if since no one would accept me in Buffalo, if I could ever meet a beatnik, they would accept me. And in
Right.
fact, my father made a huge mistake when I was 16. Instead of putting us in the car and driving us to Mexico or driving us to St. Petersburg, Florida, or any of his usual destinations, he drove us to Cape Cod to Provincetown.
Mm.
And Provincetown is a summer headquarters, he didn't know this, for the Beatniks. So I was walking down the street in Provincetown. I'm 16 years old. There was a gallery that had some interesting work in the window. I walked into the gallery. There's this bunch of adults in their 30s, and they're all talking. They're all beatniks from the lower west, from the Village in Manhattan, the heartland of beatnicism. And they incorporate me in the conversation. They keep me there for the next 2 hours as a peer,
Wow.
as if I'm one of them. And it was my first real live introduction to beatniks. So when my dad took us back to Buffalo, New York, and once again I had nobody, they shipped me off eventually to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, which had the highest median SATs of any school in the country, higher than Harvard, higher than Caltech and MIT.
Wow.
And eventually I dropped out. I dropped out in the top 10% of my class, but I dropped out because I was looking for Zen Buddhist enlightenment, which is something the hippies I learned about from reading about the hippies. And after I dropped out, I decided to go find the hippies. I mean, here I was on the West Coast, and the center of hippie culture was San Francisco.
Right.
And it was specifically the City Lights bookshop, which was owned by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was one of the two masters of beat poetry. So I hitchhiked from the Northwest Pacific, actually from Seattle, all the way down to San Francisco, looking for the hippies who were supposed to be in North Beach. And I found my way to North Beach, and I found my way to the City Lights bookshop.
Wow.
I didn't see a single hippie anywhere in sight. There was the bookstore was empty.
Wow.
There was one guy behind the counter. He was busy reading a book. He didn't even look up when I walked into the room.
Wow.
I said, "But where are the hippies?" And he ignored me. He didn't even answer the question.
Wow.
So I walked out of the bookstore looking as if I had just been sledgehammered. And somebody, strangers can be extremely kind. A total stranger walked up and said, "You look troubled about something. Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm looking for the beatniks." And he rolled his eyes up into his head, and he scratched his forehead, and he thought for about 2 minutes, and then he opened his eyes again, and he said, "Have you tried Colorado?" And that was just a little too vague a destination for me.
Wow.
So I hitchhiked back to my friends in Seattle. But what happened is I was busy pursuing Zen Buddhist enlightenment. And I was doing it apparently with such ferocity that even though I had nothing but questions, people saw me as having answers. And they started dropping out of their jobs and following me and my friends down the West Coast. And we ended up in a big pink condemned house in Berkeley,
Wow.
3 blocks from the Berkeley University campus. And one day these two people appeared in a little red MG. Have you ever seen those? They're little red British sports cars, little convertible British sports cars.
Wow.
Well, at any rate, so they showed up in this little MG. They had heard about us at the University of Virginia. They had dropped out of school. They had jumped into this MG, and they had driven all the way across the country, 2,500 miles, to see us. How they had found us, I don't know. How they had heard about us, I don't know. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have the internet.
Right.
We didn't have any of the tools of modern communication. We were stuck with phones that were wired to the walls, and that was it. So we became a hub. And I would eventually leave the country and go to Israel for 13 months and live on a kibbutz, trying to see whether a totally Marxist commune would do away with the normal human flaws. It doesn't. And when I came back, on the cover of Time and Life magazine were these people called the hippies. In other words, Time Life publications, which always needed new excuses to put sex in its mix, had discovered the group that I had left behind and had given it a name, the hippie movement, and was using it. But Maitreya, I'm sure I was not the only one to whom this was happening. I'm sure there must have been other catalytic individuals, and all of us were basically expressing something new and previously unexpressed in the zeitgeist.
Right.
So that was my role in accidentally starting the hippie movement, but the book is an opportunity to look at the hippie movement and the 60s, 2 years before the 60s came to recognize itself as a unique period of time. And it's also a coming of age story. So you will recognize yourself in this story. And also, because I wrote this while I had chronic fatigue syndrome. In 1988, I came down with chronic fatigue syndrome, and for the next 15 years was restricted to my bedroom. And for the first 5 years, I was too weak to speak, and I was too weak to have another person in the room with me, even my wife. So I distracted myself at first by reading two amazing humorists, Dave Barry and P.G. Wodehouse. And these guys were so phenomenal at humor that they could lift me out of my misery and give me 2 hours of transcendence. So when I wrote the chapters of how I accidentally started the 60s, I wrote them to have that kind of utterly transcendent humor that could take you out of anything, any difficulty you might be in, and make you utterly forget them. And I wrote it as a series of letters because I knew from my own research that when we are sick, we give off repulsion cues and we lose our social contacts. And we need social contacts more than ever. Social contacts keep us alive. With social contacts, we live. Without social contacts, we die. And I wasn't interested in dying. So I put together a little mailing list of friends who might still be interested in communicating with me. And I wrote my ass off to make these chapters as absolutely hilarious as I possibly could to attract and keep friends. And it only worked on 2 friends, but at least it worked on somebody. But then one day, while I was still in bed, I don't remember how I communicated with him because email was just coming in at the time, but I got hold of a friend on the West Coast who had started his career in the music business working for the Jefferson Airplane. And if I got the Jefferson Airplane to say something positive about this book, it would really establish it as something definitive about the 60s. And when I contacted him, he said, no, I have a better idea. I'm going to get it to another one of my clients. Send me the manuscript. So we printed out the manuscript in the days before we emailed manuscripts. And he got it to his mystery client. And 6 weeks later, I got this astonishing quote saying that it was a monumental masterpiece of American literature that was filled with nonstop scientific hilarities and woo and aha experiences. And then he compared it to James Joyce. And this person's name was Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was the guy who was on the cover of Time and Newsweek when I came back from Israel. He was the face of the psychedelic movement. And it took me 10 years to find something vital out. First of all, I didn't believe Timothy Leary had written this. It was just too good. I thought my friend, the manager, had written it, and he'd gotten Timothy's approval to send it to me. And then 10 years later, I was still in bed, and 2 people came to visit me. And they were 2 people who had sat at Timothy Leary's sickbed with him for the 6 months before his death. And I I took the quote. I kept a printer next to my bed since I had to work from bed, and I printed out 2 copies of this quote and handed it to them. And as they were reading it, this very strange kind of silence descended on the room. It was the silence of the mausoleum, the silence of the tomb. And they paused. They didn't say a word when they finished reading it. And I knew why. It's because it hadn't been written by Timothy Leary. They liked me. I was already sick enough. And they were trying to figure out how to tell me that, no, this was a hoax. And after a minute, they looked at me again and they said, "This is Tim." In other words, it brought Timothy and his deathbed scene back to them so vividly that it stunned them for 60 seconds to 120 seconds. So it was a Timothy Leary quote. And then they gave me details that my mind took another 3 or 4 years to figure out. So here's what I figured out was happening. Timothy Leary got this manuscript when he was in the last 6 months of his life. He was dying of prostate cancer, and he knew it. So any woe I had gone through, any grief or pain I had gone through with my CFS, Timothy Leary was going through it 10 times over.
Wow.
Because he was dying. And so when he read the book, it did to him what P.G. Wodehouse and Dave Barry had done for me. It lifted him out of his pain, out of his circumstance. And it had, well, this is something I call secular salvation. When you are saved from hell for a few minutes or a few hours.
Right.
And that's why he wrote that astonishing, incredible quote. And it turned out when he died and the obituaries came out that James Joyce was his absolute favorite author. So to compare my writing to James Joyce's writing was the highest form of compliment he could possibly have given. So that's what that book is about. It's an adventure story of hitchhiking and riding the rails on the West Coast on a spiritual journey. But a hilarious, we hope, spiritual journey.
Wow, that's very deep because Timothy Leary is definitely a definitely interesting person. What about the Lucifer Principle? What was that book about? I'm very interested
one day, once I established my own PR firm in 1976, by 1979, I was working with Peter Gabriel. Peter Gabriel had just left Genesis and was just striking out in his own solo career. So I met with him in Manhattan to find out what was interesting about Peter Gabriel. What was at the heart and soul of Peter Gabriel? And he, before we could start a conversation, he said, "Could you do a favor for me?" And of course, that's what I'm there for. And he said, "Could you track down the author of this book on technology and the arts?" Okay, sounded interesting. So I tracked down that author, and I got Peter Gabriel and the author together for lunch the next time Peter was in New York City. But so Peter became a kind of a friend, and Peter understood the science side of me. So one day Peter walked into my office, something my clients almost never did, and he said, "There's something you should read up on. It's called the Gaia effect." And so I did. I went looking. We didn't have Google in those days, but I went looking for material on the Gaia effect and the Gaia hypothesis. And it turns out that the hypothesis is that the Earth is self-regulating and that it keeps its own temperature within a fairly narrow band, a wide enough band to have ice ages and global warmings, which we've had without humans around, but a band tight enough that life can survive. And the real description came from Natural Science, I think it's called, the Natural Museum of History's magazine. And it was an article by a woman named Lynn Margulis and a guy named Dorian Sagan. And they talked about how 2 billion years ago, the first photosynthesizers were eating what they could, including photons, light, particles of light, and then burping out what was toxic to them, what they couldn't digest. And, you know, if a bacteria farts, what's the problem? Bacteria is so small, it's ridiculous. If an entire bacterial colony is farting out what's toxic to it, what does that matter? It's a very big atmosphere, and a bacterial colony is so thin that you can't even see it. But over 1 billion years, all these bacterial farts of toxic material built up until finally we had a toxic atmosphere on Earth, a life-killing atmosphere. And then some big bacteria worked out a deal with smaller bacteria and said, basically, look, I'll take you in, I'll find food for you, I'll keep you with the ideal conditions, the conditions you love, I'll give you a paradise inside of me. All you have to do is take this toxin, this poison, and turn it into an energy source for me. So that's what the smaller bacteria did. They're the ancestors of our mitochondria. But meantime, so a new form of life arose that could eat oxygen, this poison. But in the meantime, the way that Lynn and Dorian described the great die-off that happened because of this toxification of the atmosphere was joyous. And it turned me off because I learned as a child that if you see a mass murder happening and you don't try to stop it, you are an accomplice to it.
Right.
So it instantly came to me. I had to write a book called The Lucifer Principle. It's the antithesis to the Gaia effect. It looks at the evil side of things and why the evil side of things exists and what we can do to overcome the evil side of things. And that book was The Lucifer Principle, which a lot of people have called their Bible. And I started a little list. I've been most of my life clinically depressed. So I used to wake up very often feeling of no value to anybody on planet Earth and like I shouldn't even be here. So when people started to send me notes about having read my books and what it did to their life, I started a little file so I'd be able to look at it on the days when I was feeling suicidal. And today that file is about 550 pages long.
Wow.
And one person after another wrote and said, I'm 16 years old. Life didn't make any sense to me at all. I read your book, The Lucifer Principle, and now life makes sense. And 10 years later or 15 years later, people started writing me letters saying, I'm 35 years old. And I first read your book, The Lucifer Principle, when I was 16. And your book, The Lucifer Principle, made sense of life for me and is still making sense of life for me today. You saved my life. Well, Maitreya, that's what you write for. That's what you exist for. That's true. Is to extend the powers of your fellow human beings. Is to do something that they need, something that they want. So, and I've gotten those kinds of letters since for every book that I put out, but it's the Lucifer Principle in particular who changed people's lives.
Wow. I definitely got to get it myself, and I will get it. Very interesting. What about Einstein and Michael Jackson and Me? What is that book about?
Einstein, Michael Jackson and Me is about how I accidentally tripped into rock and roll. I mean, popular culture was the culture of the kids who used to beat me up, humiliate me, and try to find a new field in which to have a baseball game just to keep me out.
Wow.
So I was not into popular culture. I was listening to Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartok, Stravinsky, and then later on I got into jazz and Dave Brubeck and Errol Garner and a whole bunch of people like that, but never into popular music. And then something weird happened in my junior year at NYU. After I finished 3 years of riding the rails and hitchhiking, I went back to school. And in my third year at NYU, the poet in residence from whom I was taking courses said, Bloom, wait until everybody leaves the room, then close the door and sit there. And he pointed to the bowling out seat on the other side of his desk. So I waited, I closed the door, I sat in the bowling out seat, and he said, look, you, last year I asked you to be on the staff of the literary magazine. You never even showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the literary magazine. You are the editor of the literary magazine. You don't even have a faculty advisor. The minute you walk out that door, you're it.
Wow.
Now walk out that door.
Wow.
So I walked out the door with the same look on my face that I'd had in San Francisco when I couldn't find the beatniks. And again, a stranger walked up to me and said, "You look troubled. Can I help you with something?" And I explained with shock that I'd just been made the editor of the literary magazine, because Maitreya, I hate literary magazines. Literary magazines have these pale eggshell covers that put you to sleep faster than any drug you can get at the drugstore. They have these terribly designed typefaces. If you took a literary magazine and you threw it into a room where there was a rip-roaring orgy, you could empty that room out within 5 minutes. Literary magazines are energy destroyers. So he said, "Why don't you come down with me for a cup of coffee?" Now, again, Maitreya, I didn't grow up with other people. And the result was I didn't know normal human rituals. So I didn't know what having a cup of coffee really means.
Right.
So we went down to the coffee shop. I ordered a glass of water. He ordered a cup of coffee. And he asked me one of the most important questions I've ever been asked in my life, which is, if you could do anything you want with this magazine, what would it be? And I said it would be a picture book. So he said, "Fine, make it a picture book." So I turned it into an experimental graphics and literary magazine, and we made a tremendous splash. First of all, first issue, the Student Activities Committee called me in. Now, I didn't know there was such a thing as a Student Activities Committee. And they lined me up in front of them, or they were all lined up. It looked like a firing squad. And they said, "We loved what you did. We're doubling your budget for the second issue." How many times does that happen? That somebody doubles your budget.
Right.
Okay. The second issue that we did, it was the Sex and Death issue. Half my literary staff quit. It was in the most gorgeous paper you've ever seen. It was 5-color printing, because we used all the traditional 4 colors plus silver. And it was quite something. So nobody wanted to have anything to do with me on campus when that one came out. When I accidentally ran into the poet in residence, who would have been avoiding me, I said, "Well, what do you think? What did you think of the magazine?" And he said, "Did you have to put in that poem by your friend Jason Schneider that starts with masturbation?" So on campus, the magazine was outre. It was outside the bounds. Meanwhile, I got calls from the art director of Look magazine, the art director of Evergreen Review. Look was a giant, full-color, glossy, bi-weekly news magazine. Evergreen Review was the leading bohemian magazine in the world. And the art director of Boys Life, which was the Boy Scouts' big, full-color magazine, to come in and see them. So when I got out of NYU, I graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa, and I graduated. Remember the head of the graduate physics department who said you won't have to save for grad school for him because he'll get fellowships in theoretical physics? Well, I got fellowships. It was in something that didn't have a name yet. Neuroscience is what it's called today. And I got big fellowships. And then I realized, I've been on the track of the mystic experience. I've been on the track of the ecstatic experience. I've been on the track of what I call the gods inside of us since I was 12 years old. Grad school is going to be Auschwitz for the mind. I will be giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students in exchange for a psychology credit. And will I ever see a rapture, a mystic experience, an ecstatic experience happen in those rooms? Never. Never in my life will I see the mystery that I've been pursuing since I was 12 years old. So when I finished school, one day I walked into the apartment of the most brilliant of the artists that I had found. And the room was empty, no furniture. There's a wall-to-wall carpet. His wife, his 3-year-old, and he were sitting on the carpet crying. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, well, our furniture has been repossessed. Our phone is about to be cut off. Our electricity is about to be cut off. And we're being evicted from our apartment. And I said, that's crazy. Your work is insanely good. Anybody who sees it is going to give you work. And with work, you can pay your rent. Give me your portfolio. I haven't decided what I'm going to be doing this summer yet before I go off to grad school. So I'll take your work out for 2 weeks. That'll give you enough money for rent, and then I can figure out what my summer job is going to be. And he said, well, if you take my work out, you have to take out my best friend's work too, because he and I came from Boston to New York City to start an art studio together. His friend's work was nauseating. It was absolutely nauseating. But I said, okay, because I've got a person who's desperate here.
Right.
I'm not in a position to quibble. So I took their work out, and the work of the wife of his friend's work, of his friend, and the wife's work was very good. She was a very good designer. And at the end of 2 weeks, I hadn't gotten them anything. At the end of the summer, I'd gotten New York Magazine interested in doing an article about our studio, but I hadn't gotten any work. And I'm obsessive compulsive. And my wife had said, I'm tired of having grad students as husbands or having students as husbands. So that meant if I went back to school, to grad school, I could easily lose my wife. And all of these things conspired. And I realized I'm going to every major advertising agency, every major publishing company, and every major magazine. I am entering the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. This is the land where I am most likely to find the gods inside, to find those ecstatic experiences at work. And this is where I really need to be, even though I've never participated in pop culture before in my life. So for me, it was a scientific expedition into the forces of history. It was field work, exploring that dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. And then, of course, I became a major figure in that industry, helping to make new myths and movements. But Maitreya, you don't make new movements. You find the beating heart, the soul of the person that you are working with, whether it's Prince or Michael Jackson or Bob Marley, whoever it is. Because I used to lecture potential clients when they would come to me, because I didn't always say yes. And I said, look, I will only say yes to you on the following conditions. You have to understand, I'm not going to fashion an artificial mask for you and tell you that with it I'm going to make you a star. I'm not going to manufacture an image. Music is not about an exchange of pieces of plastic. It is not about an exchange of money. It is not about an exchange of downloads. It is about an exchange of human soul. And if you're going to work with me, I'm going to find the soul inside of you, the gods inside of you, that write your lyrics for you, that dance you like a marionette on stage. And if you're, and that may take me, it'll take me 6 weeks to study you. And then I'm going to have to come out to your environment, whatever that is, with no wives, no managers, no intercessors of any kind. And we will find the gods that dance you on stage and that write your lyrics when you're in front of a blank sheet of paper or a blank computer screen. If you're willing to go along with that process, I will work with you. If you're not willing to go along with that process, I will call my best competitor right now, and you'll have a meeting in his office in 2 hours. So that was it. That was the way that I worked with my clients. Of course, it took years to develop that technique. I called it secular shamanism, to get it straight, to evolve it. But once it evolved, it became crucial to my work.
Wow. Yeah, finding the pulse of what makes the artist even want to create it, I think is a key to turning that lock that makes them just knowing their psychology and what makes them want to create is a very important knowledge about that artist. Yeah, I definitely agree.
Except there's one little alteration. Knowing the artist psychology, that's not exactly what you do. What you do is dig for the gods inside of the artist. Then you take what Hermann Hesse, the novelist, says you have a dark closet very deep inside of you with 10,000 personalities that could easily have been you. Well, you find the personality in there, inside of you, that it might be all emotion, you might have no words for it, but you find the one that is the personality of your artist. And you tune your empathy to that artist. So you can feel, so that, for example, with Prince, when he had not shown up at his manager's office for almost a year, and his manager, I hadn't seen him in almost a year, and his manager called one day and said, I have the lyrics for Prince's next album. You're not supposed to know that I have them. If they show up by some miracle on your desk tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, can you tell me what Prince is thinking? And Maitreya, it may sound spooky, but the answer was always yes. Look, I won't tell you yes unless I know it. I mean, in the case of the two artists that I said I will make you a star, one was Shaka Khan, the other one was Joan Jett. So I was not bullshitting you. I was telling you the truth. So when I said yes, I can empath Prince and figure out where he is right now. If you give me the lyrics, I was not messing around. That empathic part of you has enormous powers.
Wow. Oh, what was it like knowing Prince? I have to ask this. I know you heard this before, but I have to ask it.
Well, it was a strange experience. I got a phone call from Warner's when I took on the act. Look, I followed all the charts every Monday morning when the trade papers came out. I read them all cover to cover, all three of them. And I noticed that there was a record. Remember Sylvia's record that was seriously going platinum? So I saw this person I'd never heard of go up the R&B charts, the black charts. And then I saw his album go platinum. And nobody had a clue as to who he was.
Wow.
And then one day I got a call saying, you're working on Earth, Wind, and Fire. Earth, Wind, and Fire's manager has a new act. Would you like to work with it? And the act was the guy who was mysteriously going platinum on the black charts, Prince. Wow. So, of course, I said yes. But I laid out my terms and conditions. And in other words, that I get to study him for 6 weeks. Then I get to meet with him in his own environment with nobody else in the room for as many hours as it took to find the gods inside of him. And I got a call from Warner Brothers and on the West Coast. And the Warner's PR staff was terrific. They were all Harvard and Princeton level people. And the publicist, it was the black publicist, of course, because you threw your black act to your black staff still in those days, but she was brilliant. She was absolutely terrific. And she said, you're not going to be able to work with Prince. And I said, why? She said, because he can't do interviews. We set up 2 interviews with him on the West Coast, and he said absolutely nothing to the first interviewer, and he tried to strangle the second interviewer. Wow. This is an intelligent, articulate person telling you that a musician has tried to strangle an interviewer. Wow. So they flew me up to Buffalo, New York, which is my hometown, not Prince's hometown, but Prince had rented an entire theater, the Shea Theater, where I had seen a movie when I was 11 years old, to rehearse for the Dirty Minds tour. So I showed up in the audience at the Shea Theater, an audience of empty seats, and watched as Prince and the band rehearsed, and then went backstage. And the 2 of us tried to find a room that we could lock ourselves into. And we did. And we sat there from about 2 o'clock in the morning until about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, past dawn, and getting the story of Prince's life from him. And then I told him, look, we're going to set up 3 days of interviews on the East Coast, 3 days of interviews on the West Coast. I'm going to have you do 8 hours or 8 interviews on each of those days. And I took the transcript from our conversation. I took the most compelling parts of it, the parts that explain his emotional self. I put them in chronological order so they told a clear story. And then I sent that transcript back to Prince and said, I don't care what the interviewer asks you. He'll probably ask you, how do you characterize your music, which is an impossible question. To answer. It's a ridiculous question. And I want you to answer with the material in this transcript, because this is your story. And I want you will feel self-conscious about repeating the story over and over again. You will be tempted to say, well, as I told the previous guy, you never say anything like that. You do it as if you've never told the story to anybody in your life. Wow. You are accustomed to doing that with your songs. You do the same songs night after night after night, but every time you have to have that energy of never having done them before. That's what you have to do with these interviews. And Prince did it. He went through 3 days of interviews in New York, 3 days of interviews in California, and he did extremely well. And from that point on, he regarded me as a kind of finishing school. So whenever he developed a protege, he sent them to the Bloom Finishing School. So I could do the same thing with them that I had done for him. But I never found as compelling a story among the proteges as I did with Prince until he did Under the Cherry Moon. And, oh God, what is the name of the star? Kristen Scott Thomas. And he found Kristen Scott Thomas in France. And Kristen Scott Thomas was as compelling as an individual as Prince. And she's had Academy Award nominations, and she's won BAFTA awards in Britain. She's brilliant. She's terrific.
Wait,
so
I've never heard of her.
Oh, if you look her up, it's in The Horse Whisperer, she's the mother. Okay. In The English Patient, I forget what role she is, but she got Academy Award nominations for that role. In the Darkest Hour, I think it is, the Winston Churchill film, she's Winston Churchill's wife. There's a brilliant movie called Fishing in the Yaman, in Yemen. Salmon fishing in the Yaman. And she just makes that movie happen. She is a transcendent actress. She's utterly phenomenal. So, but that's what it was like working with Prince. Prince is a workaholic. He doesn't really open his emotions to you. You know that he loves you if you're standing in the underground areas of a huge outdoor stadium, and there are another 100 people milling around, all of them in some way or another working for Prince, and you feel a tap on your right shoulder, and you look around to your right and see that there's nobody there, so you look around to your left, and 100 feet off, having run past you, is Prince, and he's waving. So you know he still loves you, even though he's afraid to get together with you, because Prince was afraid of men. It took me years to realize, Matria, that Prince was approximately 5 feet tall.
Right.
For years, I saw him as big or bigger than I was. And I was 5 foot, almost 5'8" at the time. But Prince is tiny. Now imagine what it must be like going to anywhere from kindergarten to 12th grade with other kids when you are tiny, especially in a black community where women prize height.
That's right.
And they don't want a guy in their bed who's under 6'1".
They sure don't.
So you are more of an outcast than you would be in any other community. So Prince built his own society when he was 13 years old. He built it in his friend Andre Simone's basement. And it was based on a principle that had been vital to the community I had helped establish on the West Coast in the 1960s. Make love, not war.
Right.
That was the central theme. Now, how a guy who's only 5 feet tall is going to get women, God alone knows, but he had them.
Yeah, he sure
I
did.
spoke to an eyewitness. He had them, even in high school. So Prince is one of the guys that I focus on a lot is Sigmund Freud. Because Sigmund Freud has this book called Moses and Monotheism. And in that book, he describes how Moses took a group of people who were outsiders in Egypt and were shat upon and were slaves in Egypt and led them out of Egypt and made a new people out of them. He gave them a new slogan. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In other words, there's just one God, and he's our boss.
Right.
And he made them put that on their wrists 3 times a day or something like that, and on their foreheads 3 times a day. And he made them put it on the doorposts of their houses. So they would be hit with this slogan more frequently than any Pepsi or Coca-Cola ads you've ever seen in your life. And how he had kept them wandering around the desert for a full generation so that he wouldn't take them to their destination until all their parents' old practices and memories had died out. And he had a fresh generation of kids who were weaned on this slogan. So Moses, in Freud's eyes, was the ultimate subculture maker, the ultimate group fuser. And Freud studied Moses because he too wanted to found a subculture that would continue after he was gone, which he succeeded in doing. We're still talking about Sigmund Freud today, and he's been dead for roughly 100 years. So Prince was another one of those subculture makers. He created his own distinct society when he was a teenager, and he spent the rest of his life living within societies he had created and which he had led.
Very interesting. Wow. What about Michael Jackson? What was it like working with him? What made him special?
It's a subject for a whole other interview because Michael was not like any human I'd ever imagined in my life. He was the closest thing to a saint that I never imagined. He had a quality of awe, wonder, and surprise that was beyond human. It was divine. And his commitment to his kids, meaning the 10,000 kids he carried around in his chest, and the hundreds of millions of kids that he actually had an influence over, his commitment to them was absolute. He would not let anything get in the way of his connection with those kids. And I watched as Michael became Michael Jackson for 25 years and then was nailed to the cross and spent the last 25 years of his life dangling, and tortured by negative publicity.
Wow. Let me see. Oh, I got a question. Have you ever heard of the freedom rider Rabbi Israel?
No, who's that?
Yeah, he was a freedom rider he was a Jewish rabbi who rode on a freedom ride bus, and he definitely walked with Martin Luther King in Selma.
Wow.
Yeah, he just
Martin
passed
Luther
away.
King is another example of one of these charismatic, iconic personalities. And in the case of all of my artists, becoming what they were depended not just on who they were inside, but on having a good team. And Prince had a good team. Michael Jackson had a strange team, but they all had teams. And Martin Luther King Jr. was the product of a team of three people. Those three people were Martin Luther King Jr., Harry Belafonte, who was an incredible political activist and incredibly good at keeping himself invisible. But he knew everybody. He could get to everybody. And there was a Jewish guy named something like Stanley Levine, who, and the three of them together were Martin Luther King. So a point I made to you, I think, on a message, LinkedIn message a long time ago, is that us Jews have been very involved in the civil rights movement from the very beginning, because we don't like the way that we've been treated, and we didn't want to see anybody else treated that way. And the people who were being treated that way were blacks, and we have wanted to do everything we can to help them out of this subservient whipping boy position, because no human deserves to be put in that position.
And I just made that comment because I always feel, I work for an organization in New York called the Young Jewish Professionals, and I always tell black people, you need to ally with people who think like you. You have to ally.
Right, exactly. But meantime, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the black community.
Exactly.
I had to just get used to the fact that the leading black weekly newspaper in the country, the Amsterdam News, was anti-Semitic. I had to get used to the fact that what's his name, Johnson, who ran Johnson Publishing, was not just anti-Semitic, he was anti-white. He would not meet with you or take your phone call if you were white. There was another person like that, Percy Sutton, who was the borough president of Manhattan and owned a huge chain of very powerful black stations across the country. Percy Sutton wouldn't take a call from a white man, but Maitreya, he would take a call from me. And the reason he would take a call from me is because he met me via a meeting with Bob Marley. The two of us were both at this meeting. The two of us both, in some way, made very significant contributions. In fact, he led the meeting. Wow. So I called him because I was working with Hall & Oates. And Hall & Oates had grown up on the role model what are they called? It's one of the Motown black groups. And so when the Motown black group that they idolized would come to Philadelphia, they would wait outside the stage entrances just to get close to these guys for a second, for 10 seconds. The Temptations. That's who
that
it
makes
was.
sense. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And so when I found this out, the Apollo Theater had been closed. Now, the Apollo Theater, is the beating heart of black musical culture. And without it, there's a dark spot where there needs to be an organizing force, a central force. So I got a call from one of my clients, a percussionist named Ralph McDonald, saying, we're reopening the Apollo Theater. Would you be interested in doing the PR? Well, of course. This is a major black institution. So I did all the work to publicize this reopening of the Apollo Theater. And then on the night of the opening, the whole block, it seemed, was part of the process of celebrating the reopening of the Apollo Theater. And that is a very important block in Harlem. And my client, Ralph, said, would you like to meet the person who's been paying your bills? Well, of course. So he took me over to this guy who was about 6'2", who radiated this glorious smile, who was in a tuxedo, and introduced me. And the name of the guy was Nicky Barnes. Now, once upon a time, the Italians, the mafia, owned the drug concessions, the prostitution concessions, and the numbers concessions in Harlem. And then a black gang came along and took it away from them. Imagine what you have to do to take a lucrative territory away from the mafia. And the person who dominated that black gang, who led that black gang, was Nicky Barnes. So I was shaking hands with a man with one of the most gloriously charming smiles you've ever seen, who had probably been responsible for the deaths of at least 20 people in his rise to power. Then the Apollo Theater closed again. And then this is over a 10-year period. And then I got word that that the head of these black stations, the person I had met, Percy Sutton, via Bob Marley, was reopening the Apollo Theater. So I was sitting with Tommy Mottola, Hall & Oates manager, and said, that these guys have always wanted to be the Temptations. Why don't we reopen the Apollo Theater with Hall & Oates and the Temptations? And Tommy's eyes lit up, and he loved the idea. And again, we're working with the soul of our act, right? With the soul of Hall & Oates, which is the Temptations. And I said, okay, I will get Percy Sutton on the phone, which is impossible for a white person, if you get the Temptations. So Tommy got the Temptations, and I got Percy Sutton. And Percy said, our opening night is booked, but our second night isn't booked. Would you like the second night? Well, of course. It doesn't have the same bang as the opening night, but it's important. It's significant. And I said to Tommy, look, there are these things that are selling big these days. There are video cassettes, and you can make a video cassette of this concert, which he did, and it became a best-selling video cassette. So the fact is, you are quite correct that we have to work together in alliances when we share a common aim. And especially when it's one as deeply shared as human rights, civil rights, all of these things. And the black anti-Semitism, I don't know how to deal with that.
We're dealing with it right now.
Well, I hope so.
By us coming together and talking about it, and you're spreading your knowledge and your information and your role in music history. We're doing it right now.
Beyond that, when I was 16 years old, remember, nobody in my hometown wanted to have anything to do with me. And I met a kid who did seem to want to have something to do with me. And he was the head of the Unitarian Youth Group. Now, look, I'm a Jewish atheist. I'm certainly not a Unitarian. But he persuaded me to join the Unitarian Youth Group, which I did. And then he made me head of the Social Action Committee. Now, right at that point, the Social Action Committee was committed to doing everything in its power to get rid of redlining. Well, I had never heard of redlining before, so I had to become an expert overnight. And redlining is the practice of only selling homes to blacks within a ghetto.
Right.
And when blacks try to buy a home outside that ghetto, no, they are shut down, period. They cannot get a loan. They cannot buy the building. And that was something, so that's something I got involved with at the age of 16 years old, which would have been 1959. So civil rights has played a role in my life. It hasn't been my dominant theme until I got fucking goddamn angry and pissed off that ABC Records' white staff would not work with Rufus because Shaka Khan was black. That just pissed me off and really motivated me for the next 10 years.
Wow.
But I was only incidentally involved with the civil rights movement until I ran across these ghetto barriers in the record companies. And then I got furious.
Yeah, because I always felt like I said, the Jewish community gets, they go through religious, anti-Semitism. They go against religion. People don't like their religion. They go through anti-Semitism. How you say it?
Anti-Semitism.
Semitism. Black people get into racism because of their skin color. I mean, it's a natural. We're natural allies. I just never understood it. Like, I just never understood it.
Absolutely,
I really don't.
100%.
Yeah,
we're natural allies, but the trick is to defeat somehow that element of anti-Semitism. I mean, Louis Farrakhan. Look, he's the master of anti-Semitism. He says Jews are cockroaches, meaning they should be exterminated, meaning that he's as genocidal in his thought process as Adolf Hitler was.
Well, I have seen that Russell Simmons behind the scenes has been talking to Farrakhan to help bridge that gap because I don't know everything he says because I'm not Muslim. I'm an atheist.
Right.
I'm a transhumanist, so I don't follow up on everything that he does. But I do know that in the black community, other people find him as a leader. Right. So, but like I said,
plus he has a very highly organized system for converting prisoners.
Yeah, that's true. That's a fact. Yeah, you're right. You're definitely right.
And when we were just taking off with rap, when I was getting that lecture about how it was shit, one person recognized the potential of this music and started taking one potential star after another, people like Queen Latifah, and taking them in off the street and, quote, educating them.
Right.
And educating them meant making them read The International Jew by Henry Ford, which is one of the books that helped justify Adolf Hitler in the Holocaust. And so he was turning the same stars that I was doing my best to help, he was taking them and turning them into violent anti-Semites. And all that anti-Semitism that Louis Farrakhan has been spreading for the last 50 years is out there, just waiting for the moment when it can be kindled and become not just a bunch of loose matchsticks laying across the landscape, but a giant flame.
Is this can we ever, anybody in the Jewish community, can they ever repair this situation between Farrakhan?
Well, I think there are lots of people who've been trying. There have been movements to link the two communities ever since I was a child. But, when people are set in a particular point of view, getting them unset is very difficult. So, and my time, I fought on behalf of the black community on its right to exist and to be proud of who it is. And I had no time to try to fight anti-Semitism. I've never been engaged in that battle.
Question for you. I understand that. Question for you. Is there anybody in the Jewish community that are racist? Because you have to be on. Yeah. You have to be
when I was a child, one day I was about 4 years old, and I and the other kids on my block for once were playing with me. And we were standing at the top of a stoop, and there was a little black girl our age who was missing all of her fingers. She just had little tiny fingernails were fingers. should be. And we were all looking at that. And meanwhile, we were chanting, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe." Well, in my father's time, that those words had been "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a nigger by the toe."
Wow.
They had been changed by the time I came along. But my dad didn't know that. And look, we didn't see any difference between this little black girl and us, except for the weirdness of her hand, and we weren't put off by that. We just thought, here's something interesting to look at, knowing that she had to live with that every day. So my dad thought we were doing the old version of "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." And we weren't. And my dad was passionately anti-racist. Passionately. And my dad said, never say those words again. Because he didn't understand that we were saying, catch a tiger by the toe. And we had never heard of the version that he automatically heard. But one day, some relatives were driving through Buffalo, New York, my hometown, and they came to visit us. And I was still about 4 years old, and I was under the dining room table, and which was considered a perfectly natural place for me to be. I was a toddler. And I heard my relatives making anti-black statements. And that was a shock to me, because that did not exist in my home. And that did not exist in the image I was given of the black community at large. Certainly was never, nothing of that sort was ever a part of any service get-together. It was only this bunch of relatives from New Jersey who would later become, I mean, their kids and grandkids would become Trump supporters. But it was only among that little subgroup that I heard anti-black stuff.
Well, what can we do to forge these greater relationships between two communities who've been persecuted?
Well, right now there's an opportunity, because there is a movement to stop human rights, to stop freedom of speech, to stop the anti-racist movements. And that movement that's trying to crush all of this, we call it authoritarianism these days. It's dictatorship. It's the form of government used by Xi Jinping, who is a Han racist, by Vladimir Putin, and by their allies in Syria, in Iran, in North Korea, in Venezuela, and in Cuba. And if we don't win this battle with the anti-democratic forces, with these dictatorial forces, you and I will never be able to have a conversation like this again, assuming that we live through what follows. Because you only say what you are allowed to say in Xi Jinping's China or in Vladimir Putin's Russia. So the black community, the white community, the Asian community, they all have a common purpose. Even the religious community and the secular community all have a common purpose. They cannot squabble with each other unless they have the freedom of human rights. And if this new colossus takes over that thinks that the idea of human rights is a sin, that it's a stain on the existence of the cosmos, that it needs to be totally wiped out, if we let those people take over, everything we know, even our rights to be prejudiced against each other, will disappear. So we have a greater common purpose that can unite us at this point. And frankly, if Vladimir Zelensky does not win in the Ukraine, and Russia does, even if they win concessions like the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk that they've been claiming are people's republics since 2014, if they win even that, they will move on to Poland, they will move on to Moldova, they will move on to Romania, and they will, look, Vladimir Putin told us what he wants to take in November. And it's every single one of the 6 countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, right there.
And his counterpart in China, Xi Jinping, wants to take Taiwan. and has
Right.
just concluded a security agreement with an island 2,000 miles out into the Pacific that threatens Australia and New Zealand, called the Solomon Islands. A security agreement, which means that China is looking forward to building military bases there. So we have two land empires, and land empires expand by swallowing their neighbors
Right.
and then claiming that they are insecure because the boundaries that they've swallowed are not good enough. So they're constantly expanding. One of those land empires that's expanding like an amoeba is Russia. The other land empire that is expanding like an amoeba is China. And there is a certain tipping point that we will arrive at. Right now, we still maintain a position of leadership in the world. It's a lot more tenuous than it was before 2016, before Donald Trump tried to wipe it all away and just become and make us Vladimir Putin's puppets. But it's there. That leadership is still there. If we lose in places like the Ukraine, that leadership is going to diminish, and the social magnetism that we've had toward the rest of the world is going to shift to Russia and China, primarily China. So we have a crusade for everything we believe in ahead of us, for human rights, pluralism, tolerance, freedom of speech.
Wow.
We have to crusade. And right now we have to give Vladimir Zelensky airplanes. We have to stop pissing around and give him airplanes.
Well, do you think that if we start giving more and more military weapons, that there might be some type of nuclear?
Vladimir Putin plans on it. In 2000, Vladimir Putin saw what was happening in the Balkan War and how helpless the Slavs there had been against the West, specifically the United States. And he wanted to make sure that Russia was never in that humiliated, defeated, powerless position. So he supervised a total rewrite of Russia's military doctrine. This is the year 2000, 22 years ago. And in that military doctrine was the use of battlefield nuclear weapons. And he called it de-escalation, the use of battlefield nuclear weapons. In other words, if the enemy is beating your pants off, bring out the nukes and stop the enemy. Get them to de-escalate out of total fear. And take advantage of the fact that the West is going to be more frightened than you are about nuclear weapons. And that gives you the edge, because you can use nuclear weapons. So it is said that Vladimir Putin has over 2,000 battlefield nuclear weapons. It's a fact that ever since 2000, in every single military exercise, a portion of that exercise has been dedicated to practicing the use of nuclear weapons. And remember the so-called military games that were being held outside the borders of Ukraine just before the war, when Putin was claiming, we have no intention of invading anybody. The last day of those exercises was dedicated to practicing the use of nuclear weapons. So at some point, Vladimir Putin is almost certainly going to roll out the nukes. He's going to try to, quote, de-escalate by rolling out the nukes. And we really have to be prepared for that. I hope our military is prepared for that, because that's going to be, I look at my city every day, New York City, which I love. I look out at the skyline and I think this whole city could disappear as easily as the cities in Ukraine are disappearing. And I go to my park and I realize my whole park could just be turned into a wasteland over in minutes. So I'm very aware that we live under a nuclear shadow. But we really have to have ways to counter this. And so far, instead of countering it, our media is downplaying it. And it's real.
How do you downplay it? No one really will survive in a nuclear war. Not too many people.
That's right. But what Putin is counting on is the, quote, limited use of nuclear weapons. So let's say unleashing a nuclear weapon in, I forget the name of the city that he's leveled to the ground at this point, Metapole or something like that. but just using it on a city to demonstrate this is what will happen to you if you keep fighting me. So we also have tactical nuclear weapons, but they were developed a long time ago, and who knows how many of them we have, and who knows what value they would be. I would imagine no value, but again, the bottom line, the priority is Vladimir Putin has done such a magnificent job of leadership that even Rasmussen, the right-wing Republican polling organization, came out with figures yesterday saying that Volodymyr Zelensky has a 78% approval rating across the board, Democrats and Republicans in the United States. He is the leader of our time, and he is on the front lines. And if he asks you for a weapon, don't second guess him. Give him the fucking weapon, because the Ukrainians are one of the most creative people on the face of the earth, and he will probably find ways of using it, or his troops will find ways of using that weapon that you never thought of. So stop second guessing. Just send the stuff on the shopping list. He wants 1,000 rockets a day, 500 anti-tank rockets, 500 anti-air rockets. Give them to him. There have been 21 Russian battleships that have been off the coast of Ukraine, able to shell the Ukrainian territory with long-range artillery pieces and able to launch cruise missiles, including hypersonic cruise missiles. Give Vladimir Zelensky anti-ship missiles. They've been around since the Argentine War, whenever that was, 20 or 30 years ago. Give them to him. Let him tell you what he needs. Because we're just lucky that the Ukrainians have the spirit to carry the sword of Vladimir Putin.
I have another question. Do you know? I know you heard of the doomsday clock.
Right.
How?
I subscribed to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists when I was 14 years old. Yeah. And they're the ones who maintain the doomsday clock. So the doomsday clock has been in my face ever since.
Wow. Do you think that we're closer to midnight on the state of where the world is at?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are on the cusp of midnight. Wow. So we have to play our cards very well, and we have to, again, it all comes down to the same thing. Give the Ukraine the weapons it needs so that the battle stops there and doesn't go any further. Well, I should run.
Yeah. Wow, this was a great talk. I have one more question before I go.
Okay,
Do you know about, I always talk to Stephen Valentine about you. I said, man, if we had a publicist like Howard Bloom, the time ship would have been built. Where do you stand on life extension?
Well, because I had a battle way out of my bedroom when I was in bed for 15 years with CFS, I've worked out a lifestyle and a set of drugs and supplements and everything that seems to be doing life extension. Because I'm 78 years old, Matria.
Wow, you're doing pretty good.
And this morning, and 5 days a week, I do 1,250 vibrational plankings in the morning.
Wow.
A whole set of exercises with physical therapy bands. I walk on a good day 5.5 miles. Wow. And that's every single day, with the exception of today because it was raining. Right. And you're not supposed to be able to do any of this at the age of 78.
Yeah, that's true.
And my mind is sharp as can be. So apparently, I mean, there's one experiment that shows up in life extension called parabiosis. You've probably heard of it. You take an old rat whose brain is aging, his heart is aging, his kidneys are aging. You hook up his circulatory system to the circulatory system of a young rat. And the old rat's brain starts to reverse the aging process. His heart starts to reverse the aging process. His kidneys start to reverse the aging process. And in looking for the magic ingredient that's in the blood of the younger rat that is rejuvenating the older rat, the one thing I think that they've pinned down is called oxytocin. And so oxytocin apparently reverses aging. Well, in order to get out of CFS, in order to get out of my bed, I had to start giving myself a daily injection of 1 cc of oxytocin. And this is before the parabiosis experiments established that oxytocin was a key active ingredient in this rejuvenation process. So maybe my combination of things that got me out of bed does a good deal more than get you out of bed.
Wow. Well, thank you, Mr. Bloom. This was definitely an interesting topic. Just your whole life is interesting, and I'm glad you took the time out to come holler at Superlongevity Institute that's focused on the hip hop community, because we don't really get a lot of brilliant minds trying to chat with us and give us the wisdom that we need in order to further advance and preserve the culture. So I said, thank you for coming on, and this was a brilliant talk. Thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. So I'll see you again soon.
Yes, and I'll send you the video.
Okay, thanks, Matria.
Thank you.